All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Jim Jansen. I'm joined today by Anastasia Meyer, and we will be co-leading the first installment of Land Management Quarterly here for 2026. It's hard to think we're already um, midway through February of 2026. And today's presentation, what we have for goals for being covered today include current state of cash rents and land, mainly cash rents in Nebraska. Anastasia will be taking a look at some leases and then also a review of questions that have been sent in. Some of the questions that have been sent in, I will try to highlight. I didn't prepare a specific slide for them, but I will try to highlight it throughout the material in the first part here. And I think there might have been one that Anastasia might be discussing a little bit on her portion of the material as well. Be aware that if you'd like to ask a question, you can either type a question into the chat feature inside of Zoom, or I believe there's a Q&A question feature as well. Anastasia and I will both be monitoring those as we're going along here today. And be sure to type in things there. And also today's webinar will be recorded and the recording will be posted online. So anyone is more than welcome to access this at a later date and time if you have the interest. So briefly for our outline that we have planned today, our first part, we're going to be talking about trends in cash rents for 2025 through 2026. When are things getting published? What do we need to be aware of? Second part will be a little bit on lease arrangements, things surrounding, as many of you might be discussing, cash rent leases or crop share leases for cropland, and as well as possibly cash rent leases for grazing land. There's a lot of interest on that topic. And also, where can you find written leases if that's something that you'd be interested in doing? And the third part today, we're going to be reviewing some questions that we've had asked and trying to provide you with some degree of insight, and also highlight some of the upcoming landlord tenant cash rent workshops that we have available. So we'll go ahead and keep moving along here. So let's first talk about cash rents. And once again, if you have questions as we're going along, be sure to type those either into the chat or the Q&A, and we'll try to address those in a timely. So first thing today, be aware that when it comes to the regional cash rent information, that information may be found as part of the farm real estate survey work that the University of Nebraska does. We do two different things each year. The first part, we do what is called the preliminary estimates. Those are published typically in the middle of March, and then the final report is published in June. The final report has all the preliminary estimate information in addition to the final report. So for the 2026 cash rents, and we'll give you some ideas on how to estimate some here for 2026, but the 2026 cash rental rates will be published in the middle of March 2026 on the Nebraska Farm Real Estate website. Or the other option is if you reside in Nebraska and like to stop by your local extension office, many of the office managers across Nebraska will also have a copy prepared that you could either maybe have it mailed to you or more likely stop by and grab a copy if you'd like to do that as well. So middle of March 2026 will be the first snapshot we have on 2026 cash rents, and the full report comes out in June. So a few things to highlight here. People are always getting after us this time of the year asking about our thoughts might be on cash rents for 2026. And I'm sure there's many negotiations going on between the landlords and tenants right now, trying to evaluate some of these different things. And sometimes we have to take a step back to know where we might be headed in the future. And we will step through where cash rents have been for 2025, and I'll try to give you some things to be thinking about here. A few things to note. The update for 2026 and the information we have published on this slide right here is actually from the Nebraska Farm Market Real Estate Report and Market Survey. We provide what is called HAL. HAL stands for the average of the high grade or H, average of the low grade or L, and then the overall average of A. And we see across the different regions, we go from the high grade, low grade, and overall average. And these cash rents are not specifically associated. There's not a question on the survey that says, for example, cash rents in the central district with an overall average of 125, if there has to be, say, a certain soil type or crop yield or rainfall amount. I will say that we tend to see higher cash rents in areas that have a better yield, lower cash rents in some areas that might have a lower, maybe not quite as good of ground. And those get reflected into or bid into the cash rental rates. And with that being said, inside of each of the regions, the farther east you move inside of each region, you tend to see more rainfall. And the farther west you move inside each region, you tend to see a little bit less rainfall or a little bit less consistent rainfall. And across Nebraska here, from the southeast to the northwest, the extreme southeast tip of the state, we see maybe 30 to 34 inches rain, kind of around 32 inches. And if you move to extreme northwest Nebraska, where Shadwell, Nebraska is, you might be talking closer to 10 to 12 inches of rain. Overall average, maybe around 12 inches in good years. So that rainfall makes a big influence, quality of the soil, how productive it is for the certain type of crop you might like to be raising. Also, rainfall, all those different things have an influence or an impact on the cash rents paid across some of these different regions. Now, onto the irrigated cash rental rates, be aware that the University of Nebraska, in addition to publishing the center pivot rental rates, they also publish the gravity or flood irrigated cash rental rates for irrigated cropland. And those rates tend to rent for around $30 to $50 an acre more, or excuse me, less than the center pivots. So we didn't highlight these in our short talk today, but be aware that you can go back and find either in the upcoming March, or you can go back and look at prior year publications for the gravity flood irrigated compared to the center pivot irrigated cash rents. The center pivot cash rents, which are published on this slide, are about $30 to $50 an acre higher than the gravity or flood irrigated rates, with the considerations related to the improvements. And the rental rates that we have published here assume that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system. So an example, the cash rent published here in the Central District at $285 an acre assumes the landowner owns this pivot, the pump, the power unit, in addition to the land. If the tenant is contributing one of those things, so say for example, if the tenant provides the pivot or the power unit, well, based on some survey work we did back in 2022, we've seen that the cash rental rates typically run about $10 to $15 an acre lower when the tenant provides a power unit, and around 35 to maybe even 45 an acre less when the tenant provides a pivot. Remember, when the tenant provides one of those components to the irrigation system, the landowner would not be the one responsible for upkeep, maintenance, insurance, or anything related to that. And cash rental rates that we have reported here, once again, we go from the high grade to the low grade, or the high third average to the low third average, with the overall average. These are for 2025. Now, what are the things we're thinking about here for 2026 when it comes to cropland? Well, the quality of the land, configuration of the parcel, water availability. Do you have good quality water? Do you have water in an area that might be limited due to drought concerns, for example? Those are all a big concern. And also, just on the topic of cropland in general, how are input expenses comparing against 2025? And the things that have been expressed across the state offices for the extension service to the university, it seems based on different phone calls and emails that we've been taking across our Center for Ag Profitability team, the big three that are a concern, so seed, fertilizer, and chemicals, many of those expenses are just as high as they were last year, and in some cases even higher, especially for certain types of fertilizer or even chemical products. So what does that mean? Well, that means that our break evens remain quite high on rented ground. And with those high cash rental rates, we have to figure out a cash rent that makes sense for both parties involved. Now, when we talk about grazing land cash rents, and this comes from the University of Nebraska, we report on two different rates. We can talk about a cow-calf pair rental rate. So one cow, one calf for 1 month during the summer grazing season. So let's look at the Central District. You can pick any district, but just for an example, let's say this rate was $70 an acre even. If it was $70, 70 times 5 is 350. Okay. That would be for the traditional 5-month grazing season. If you have a situation where a tenant might be grazing for an off-season period or some type of rotational grazing, you might make some adjustments to this. Also, the university reports on a per acre basis, and you'll see from the USDA information we have expressed here They also report on a per acre basis as well. So when we talk about profitability of livestock versus crops, the expectation based on current prices might indicate or might suggest that the profitability seems to be a little bit more favorable on the cow-calf or the cattle industry side compared to the crop side. So it might be a little bit of a tale of two stories when you talk about cash rents and what direction things might be headed and things of that nature. Well, it has to do a lot with where are the input expenses, production expenses, and what's the output or the price for what we're growing or producing. Those are the things we got to be talking about. And there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding that. So you might see some folks looking at things called flexible cash leases, bonus cash leases, all in an attempt to address or maybe evaluate some of these things. Now, another survey that's done is done by the USDA. The USDA has a division called NASS. NASS stands for the National Agricultural Statistics Service. In recent years, they have been conducting what is called a county level cash rent survey. Now, the USDA NASH Cash Rent Survey is published. Usually you see their maps popping out, and I know this past late summer, early fall, a lot of this stuff was getting published right around when folks were, when fall was occurring. And with that being said, the cash rents were, they were delayed by what was termed as government shutdown at the federal level. So we had some delay in some of these maps, and we helped put a little article together here at the University of Nebraska on the bottom of this site. And you can either visit the USDA website, visit the University of Nebraska, but there's a little analysis published on our website. And once again, this survey is published later in the growing season, and it is done independent of the University of Nebraska. Now, we did do a little analysis and make a couple maps from it, but the survey, once again, is done based on the USDA survey process, independent of the regional cash rent survey that the University of Nebraska does. If you'd like to find it, I encourage you to take notes of those websites. And once again, this recording will be posted later, and you're more welcome to go back and visit these as well. Now, looking at the county level cash rent survey results, we have three different maps that we're going to present. We're looking at the first one here, and if you'll notice on the bottom left-hand corner, we say go to go.unl.edu/NASS. And on this website, you'll notice these maps and a few things to point out. If you're in a county that's in a light gray or whitish tone in the color, you will notice that those cash rents were not reported because, an example, we don't have a lot of cropland, especially dryland cropland, that we'd have enough people reporting on it, say out in the sandhills, or there are certain areas where it's predominantly irrigated. You may not have enough dryland cropland folks to report on their cash rent survey estimates. So that's the breakdown that we see right here. And let's pick on the Northeast District for a second. I say this is a good estimate to see how cash rents vary around. Remember, I'm going to slip back here for a few slides. We will be publishing this in the middle of March 2026. This will be getting updated about around Husker Harvest Days time, so about the middle of September, I expect to see an update on this map. That'll be for 2026. And nonetheless, you see that the cash rents vary considerably. And what I would like to point out is maybe some of these counties here in the eastern part, eastern third of the Northeast District, might follow the upper third cash rents a little bit better compared to Antelope and Boone County, which might follow the lower third cash rents, and say maybe, for example, Madison Pierce might be closer to the overall averages. So a lot of these cash rents vary based on soil, field, features. You know, are you in a county that's pretty flat, or is it gently rolling, or does it have a lot of slope, soil type? All those factors or features influence the cash rents. But I hope that those that you're watching today, especially in, say, the Southwest or Northeast, where we have some understanding on how those cash rents vary, hopefully you can gain some appreciation to gain, say, you know what, maybe some of these counties might be closer to the upper third, maybe some of these counties might be closer to the lower third, and maybe some counties might be closer to the overall average, for example. On the irrigated cash rental rates that the USDA published, they do not distinguish or segregate apart the irrigated from the center pivot compared to the flood or gravity irrigated cash rents. And that's why we see this breakdown here on cash rental rates across these different regions or counties that we have. And once again, you'll notice some counties, as for example, does Platte County have any irrigated cropland? Yes, but got to have enough people to respond to the survey that they can produce a number. And also there's pockets of, say, southeast tip of the state, parts of the northwest part of the North District may not just have very much irrigated cropland, and that's why we see some of the rates published in the manner or feature that we do. And say you're in, let's pick on Merritt County here, for example. With Merritt County, if, for example, and I don't know if this is true, but let's just say a third of the acres in Merritt County are gravity or flood irrigated, the other 2/3 of the irrigated acres are center pivot. The rates that we have published here are going to be a reflection of that difference between those two. It's going to be a weighted average. And once again, the USDA is in addition to the University of Nebraska, I believe the assumption is made that the irrigated cash rents assume that the landowner owns the entire irrigation system. On the grazing land cash rents, you'll notice a few things. There are several counties in the eastern part of the state that do have grazing land, but they didn't have enough responses that they could publish a number with confidence. So once again, if you'd like this information, you need to be sure to respond if you get surveyed on it. And this is for the traditional summer grazing season. If you're in an area that might do off-season grazing or something to that extent, just be aware that those cash rents get reported accordingly. Now, we went through a lot of different numbers, and for those folks that are whether landlords or tenants, you can kind of go back and review some of those numbers to kind of look where things have been. Still, you got to figure out where things are headed here. So I'm going to give a couple different ideas on how do we adjust cash rents. First idea is looking at regional-based information and stepping it down or adapting it to our farm or ranch. Let's say you looked at the USDA in your home county was $190 an acre. You also looked up the county corn yield. Excuse me. If you divide the two of those together, this gives us what is called the county rent per bushel. All this says is that 190 divided by 145 bushel, that gives us a $1.31 a bushel. And what this is for every bushel of grain produced in this made-up example in this county, made-up county, $1.31 is going towards what? Going towards the sale price of the grain is going towards the rent. And if we take the county rent per bushel right here, slide it to the upper right-hand corner, and let's say my farm, instead of having 145 bushel per acre, let's say over the last 5 years, it's produced about 130. It's less than the county average. Okay? If that's the case, I'm going to take the farm specific yield and multiply it by the county rent per bushel, and that gives us the farm level cash rent. Now, if you have a situation where, let's say, a farm produced 160 bushel, well, if we produced 160 bushel, we'd adjust the cash rent up a little bit to reflect having a more productive ground than what's present in the county. We take what we know on the left and we step it down to a situation we may not know quite well on the right. Okay, and next one that we have here, this is a new slide that we added here in our presentations over this last fall and this winter. If you are someone that is looking for county level yield information, I'd suggest looking up this website. And once again, this presentation will be posted after the recording's over. On this presentation, we are going to highlight where you can find the county level yields. And when we look at the RMA website, if you go on this website, and I've only had good luck looking at this website using like Firefox, something about Google Chrome I can't find, doesn't work quite right. But when you go on this website, make sure these little drop down boxes appear. And when they do, you just got to start stepping through here. So you select your commodity, your state, your counties, irrigated, not irrigated, what year or years. You can actually look up some pretty historic numbers, back 10, 20 years or so. And you can find the county yield by practice and crop if that's something that you would like to find. So And that, for instance, in 2024, when is this information available? Well, the 2024 crop wasn't available until the middle of May 2025. So the 2025 yields will not be available until, mid to late spring 2026. So about the middle of May 2026. So we had a question. Let's answer this. How do you find out the corn yield in example 145 bushel? When it comes to the county level information, once again, take a look at the USDA RMA website. And if you're looking for farm level yields, it has to be voluntarily provided by the tenant, or it has to be a provision in the lease that requests that the yield is provided. So be aware, you have to find a tenant that's willing to provide this type of information or voluntarily provide it. Unless it's a provision in the lease, the tenant, by understanding, the tenant cannot necessarily be required or forced to provide that information. And many tenants might be a little concerned providing that information because they might be concerned that the ground might be rented to someone else if you're asking for that type of information. Okay, we're going to go to the next example here. Got, I think, two more examples. One example we had here was, okay, and 466, it might be a little bit high. I think the current futures are around, 450 something, 458 or so for the planting time price guarantee for crop insurance right now. Well, let's just say we had a property that yields 160 bushel per acre. And we think this fall the price of corn is going to go up a little bit. And let's say we think the price of corn is going to be 466 a bushel. If the landlord would do a 50-50 crop share, meaning to get half of the yield, they have to bear half of the seed, fertilizer, and chemical expenses. The difference between the landlord's share of the income minus their share of the expenses was roughly what an operation might stand to make, let's say around $190 per acre. And you'll see, if you let that price vary between March to July to November, that those prices can have an influence on the cash rental rate here to some degree. That's why it's hard to say, what should the cash rents be? Well, it depends on what the profitability. The only thing that really stays fixed up here is not the yield or the price throughout the growing season, it's the input expenses. Once you put the fertilizer down or use the seed that you intended to plant, it's basically fixed for the time being. So out of these three, March, July, November, which is the most fair cash rent? Well, I would probably argue that maybe 175. What actually happens? Now, if a tenant and you knew exactly what you would stand to make off a crop share, and if the landlord did not want to participate in a crop share, or if the tenant really wanted to do a cash lease, which is fine, the tenant might come to the landlord and say, hey, how about I pay you about $175 an acre for cash rent? That's the next best alternative from crop share is doing a cash lease. The next best alternative. That's the important thing to remember there. So what we call this is cash equivalent from crop share. In lieu or instead of doing a crop share, let's do a cash lease. And that's the breakdown that we see right here. And I think we had a question come in on this. Where do we find cash rental rate information for hayland? I know many folks across the state, it's not uncommon to see on a property. Maybe you might have 20 or 30 acres of grass cut for hay, for example. Well, let's say, for example, we have a property that yields 1.5 tons per acre. And let's say you could do two different shares, a 1/3, 2/3 split or a 50-50 split. Under a 1/3, 2/3 split, the landlord gets a third of the hay or 0.5 tons. Remember, we said the property overall yielded 1.5 tons. And in the center here, we have a property that yielded, let's say, 1.5 tons. So the landlord and tenant both divide that, and you get 3/4 of a ton. And on the 50-50 split, the landlord and tenant sharing half of either the fertilizer, chemical, or seed expense. So I have said, let's say in the right-hand example, they spent $50 an acre and put some fertilizer out there. Okay, if that's the deal that was done, when we look at these two examples, we see that at 120 a ton was the value of the hay, which is a lot higher than what it's been in this past year, but we just made the assumption it's pretty good hay. And after we put up the hay, the tenant cuts the hay, bales it, stacks it, moves it around, whatever. If the landlord gets a third of the hay or a half of the hay, this basically is saying the tenant goes out to console the bales and says, "Hey, landlord, you have this many bales." The landlord comes back on the tenant and says, "Listen, why don't you just buy out my share of the hay? I don't have any stock, or I don't want to try to sell this." The tenant writes out a check. They count so many bales, they weigh it, they write out a check for the landlord's share of the hay. Under this scenario, though, they write out a check, and if you divided the total amount of hay, total revenue from the sale of the hay to the tenant by the total acres, it comes up with your cash equivalent from hay share. The tenant would say, "Listen, why don't I just write a check out for, let's say, $60 an acre?" That's just as well off. The landlord would be just as well off doing that instead of doing a share. So if you want a certain dollar amount on your hay land, or if you're really struggling on setting your cash rent for your hay land, can you go back and say, "Listen, let's look at the cash rents that we have going on here. And when we look at them, um, how about the cash equivalent from hay share?" So if you want to have $80 an acre, does the landlord and tenant both understand what that hay is going to be truly worth, or the tons per acre? I think this is one way to kind of calibrate in your cash rent on your hay land, especially when it's uncertain what things might typically look like there. Okay, with that, this is going to roll into Anastasia's section, and just give her a second here. She's going to be switching over. And you want me to,
Yep,
you want to
I'll
share your
share my
slides?
screen. Yep. Okay, can everybody see my screen well?
Yes.
All right, awesome. Um, I'm not in my typical office today. I'm in Lincoln, so just wanted to double check. So once again, I'm Anastasia. We're going to be talking about, how to adjust your leases throughout the year. Let me close some stuff so I can actually see the slides. So let's talk about updating our ag leases for the 2026 season. First off, if you weren't on this webinar because I told you that this is when we're going to be announcing our new cash rental rates, I apologize. I was under the understanding of this and I was wrong. I will say that. So I apologize if that's why you logged on, but we still have some good information to cover. So one of our questions today was, is it typical to update cash rent from year to year? Yes, any good lease will adjust for cash rent for the market up or down, right? Sometimes we forget about that down, but every cash lease should be reevaluated every single year. So the first question you need to ask us, if you can evaluate, is whether or not you have a written lease or not. Because if you have a handshake agreement or a verbal lease, remember those start March 1. They rent for the whole 12 months till the end of February. The Nebraska law says that if you want to make any changes or terminate that lease, it has to be done before September 1 the previous year. They have to have that 6 months notice. So, can you adjust the cash rental rate legally? The other party doesn't have to agree to it. However, most of the time there are good relationships between any tenant and landowner. So if you have that conversation, it's likely to say, yes, no, just have that open conversation and you'll get maybe further than what you think you might. But remember, those handshake agreements, they're going to be 6 months in advance, so you can be terminated from year to year. Most times, we see a lot of leases trending towards that 1 year lease, simply for the fact that it gives a lot of flexibility. I think, regardless of how you set up a lease in any new relationship, you should be looking at a 1 year lease. If you're more comfortable with your tenant landowner relationship, then I think you can look at longer leases with that clause that says that you're going to reevaluate that cash rental rate every single year. You don't want to be stuck on low, you don't want to be stuck high, right? We want to be adjusting every single year. So this Ag Lease 101, if you go here, you will come up to this website, you'll click on this document library, and then you have lease forms on the right hand of the screen. So, 2 slides ago, there was that example lease. I used to say prior in my year, print it off. It's a really good lease, sign it. Now I don't love it so much. I think it got a little bit too nitty-gritty detail that people aren't reading the leases all the time, and then they're finding out that they're actually breaking leases. So what do I recommend? I recommend that you pull up these forms and you find what is pertinent to your relationship with your tenant or your landowner, and you pull those out and you put them in your lease, right? Regardless, you are going to want to have your legal address, the name and contact of both individuals. You're going to want to have, when that lease starts, when it ends, and then these have some good provisions that you might want to think about as well. There's also another webinar that we did on a Thursday with CAP that has a full hour long of different lease provisions, what they mean, and if you should consider them or not. And then on the left-hand side, we have all of these different lease publications. If you give us a call and say, hey, we need to rent out the Quonset at the farmstead, we're going to look at this. We're going to tell you to adjust it because these were last done in 2014. Prices to build stuff has dramatically increased since 2014, but this is a good starting point. So, what is the critical lease provisions that we need to be thinking about for 2026? Again, you might be able to change it. You might not be, depending on what type of lease you have. If you have that written lease, it's going to really fall down into what does your lease say specifically. A lot of times in this February timeframe, people have not set that lease rate yet. So I feel like you guys can have that discussion of adjusting that cash rental rates. Realistically, what we're hearing for 2026 when we talk to bankers and when we talk to farm managers and other people, a lot of times they're just staying the same. So, watch for next month, not today, next month on what the cash rent is going to do. I've been trying to get Jim to maybe let slip what he's seeing so far, and he said that he doesn't have a good idea yet, so he can't even say anything yet. But what's important is to pay attention to the fall crop prices and the current prices, see how they differentiate. That's going to be a big deciding factor of how you adjust your cash rental rate. And remember, sometimes it's better to have a tenant who might not pay top dollar, but they treat that property well. They take care of the soil. They make sure that the weeds are under control, right? We want to make sure that we are keeping that soil fertility, that we're not mining it. If you have a good tenant and they are asking about putting lime on, and they're willing to pay for it, or they're willing to make that big investment for phosphorus, that is a large investment as well. If they're willing to do that, think about a multi-year lease and then think about having a clause in there that you can adjust that cash rental rate. Okay, so some other things that we need to be thinking about is when should that payment occur? Well, we know when taxes are going to be due every year. And so I think the first thing that we need to be thinking about is when we consider our lease arrangement is what is the relationship? Do we know that they're going to be able to write those checks half now, half later? Or do we not trust them? It's a new relationship. I want it all up front. If you do want it all up front, remember that cash rent is probably going to have 10% added on it right now because line of credits are typically running at about 10% of interest. So what do I like to see? I like to see it split up, whether it's, half now, half around harvest, or break it up into thirds, whatever meets your guys' needs, however you manage your budgets. But I do like to see the cash rents split up in good established relationships. The next thing we need to think about is if it's irrigated, who maintains it, who owns that equipment. The numbers that Jim presented, we're making the assumption that the pivot, the pump, the power unit, everything, the well is going to be owned by the landowner. So who maintains it? I like to see a good lease that has a provision that says the tenant is going to do the general maintenance repairs on it up to $1,000, maybe 500, depending on the age of your pivot. You guys can decide what's best for you. But anything above and beyond that is going to be the landowner's responsibility. This soil fertility and manure management. If you're in an area that thinks that applies manure, you might consider how much is applied. We talk about, yes, soil fertility is really important. It's costly, but sometimes you can get too much of a good thing. So if you're in a manure application area, you might limit it to once per year. And then the biggest thing that we see forgotten about in leases are the grazing of the corn stalks. And it's who gets the corn stalks. Remember, if you're cash rent, your tenant owns 100% of those corn stalks, right? That's theirs. If you're in a crop share arrangement, those corn stalks are owned by both parties. So, do you charge a rental fee? My rule of thumb is if it's a tenant's cattle going out there, if the tenant is doing all the work, the watering, the putting up the fence, the checking the fence, getting the phone calls when they're out, just let them go out there and graze. Chances are they're going to get rid of volunteer corn. They're going to remove some trash, put the manure back on. It's good. What gets a little bit tricky is if you are subleasing it to somebody else, then I think it might be fair for you as a landowner to ask for something. That's up to you. But regardless of whatever it is, I think you should have a clause in your lease that says no more than 60% is going to be removed off of the fields if you're going to bale these corn stalks. And I'm also adding this year, after driving through the countryside, 60% across the whole field. I don't want 60% baled where my field is completely bare, and then you 40% where all the stalks are remaining, right? We want good coverage on all of our ground. We want to protect it. And then don't be forgetting about those hunting rights. Hunting rights, it's a passion. And if you want to go hunting, you need to maintain those hunting rights. If you want to go hiking or fishing, whatever, if you want those rights to enter your property, you have to have a written lease. And you have to have that clause say that you're going to have those permissions, because otherwise, all hunting rights, all rights go to the tenant if you are in a verbal or handshake agreement. Again, this is a quick 1 hour webinar. We have more webinars detailing the specifics of each one of these webinars. Ryan can link that in the chat. So if you have questions, either give us a call or refer to those webinars. So remember, pasture and grazing leases do not rent out for that whole 12 months like crop ground. They're 5-month leases because grass is good for 5 months. Now, this has not been taken to court yet. So if you take it to court, let us know and we're going to really follow this. But the general understanding when the lawyers read this is saying because the pasture lease is only during those 5 months, you don't technically need to give any termination for a pasture. However, we want to be good neighbors. We want to practice those courtesy, those friendly courtesy among the tenant and landowners. So if you know you're not going to need that pasture, or if you know you're not going to let that tenant rent the pasture the next year, let them know as soon as possible. You don't want to be out there standing blocking the gate saying they cannot enter. But right now, the general understanding per Dave Aiken is that the 5 months is only when the cattle are in there grazing in a typical handshake agreement. Remember, if you have anything in writing, it's going to refer back to what you guys signed. Okay, don't forget about controlling the noxious weed and brushes. Who's in charge of it? Generally, we see a partnership. For noxious weeds, it's many times it is the tenant doing the labor and the landowner spraying, buying the chemicals, right? The brush, the general maintenance, that kind of stuff, the going out there and chopping some thistles, that tenant's going to do that. But if the big things, like if they neglect it, or if there's a big thing that happens, then the landlord can get involved, right? But also be thinking about, how do I protect my grass? How do I make sure that overgrazing does not occur on my pasture, that I'm going to have year-long effects from it, right? Fire, hail, drought. You have to have a written lease, and you have to have a clause in there that says, I have the right to ask you to remove your cattle early. We are going to prorate that rental price, and I want it in a written documentation about that. I want it written down so that if the other party dies, they can't come and say, well, you didn't pay your full amount of rent. We are looking at the bank statements or doing our taxes and you shorted us. This is why you want that documentation on any changes of the lease that you guys both signed and agreed to be, right? I do think that if you're protecting your grass and the length of the lease is adjusted, then the payment should be adjusted as well. So now we're going to come into the ask us these questions. These are a lot of what we hear throughout the year. So again, when should the cash rent be due for my crop or grazing leases, right? Grazing leases, I think it's depending on how you're structuring it. So first, let's talk about the cash rent. Again, it's depending on relationship, what the needs of each party are. But again, I like to see it split, whether it's half in March or around planting season when you guys are negotiating, and then half around harvest time. Pick a date that works for you guys. Or if you want to split it into one third, one third, one third. If you're just renting pasture, again, it can be half when they enter the pasture and then half when they exit, or you can figure out a different situation. I like that split payments a little bit in case they do remove the cattle. Maybe it's a guarantee. Maybe that's what you think. What is your bare minimum? Half of it. Again, what do you need? What can you guys agree upon? So, who should pay the bill if the tenant hires a third party to make pivots on a repair? This is a question that we get. So, is it the landlord or the tenant? Again, I like a good written lease that says, how is those repair bills gonna be charged? If it's under that $1,000, then it'd be the tenant. If it's anything over it, then it is a landowner. If you have a tenant that is putting the pivot onto your ground, right, that's going to make a difference. So who owns it? If you have a tenant that is doing that, again, they need that multi-year lease with a clause to adjust that cash rental rate. Those are how I would handle it, right? Also be willing to talk to each other. If that pivot breaks down on 4th of July weekend and you need to run it, you have to have somebody come out, but it's going to be expensive. You know, who covers that bill? Make sure you guys are willing to answer the phone when one person calls the other, right? That's something that we're really trying to work on here. The next question is, how should I rent out my land? A single year or a multi-year lease arrangement? Again, it depends. Any new relationship, I think it's okay to go year to year leases. Get that established relationship built, get each party trusting each other. I think multi-year leases are great if there's trust, because let's be honest, most people don't like paperwork. So protect yourself, put those clauses in there, and those multi-year leases is really when we see those tenants treat the ground really good, right? They're putting on the line because they know that if they get terminated, their investment is protected. They're making sure they have adequate phosphorus. They're putting a pivot on it, right? However long the lease is, make sure you have those clauses to protect both parties, right? I think a lot of times we see a lot of single year leases just because it's when an owner dies, it passes on to the heirs. And so we went from all of the handshake agreements. Now we're seeing some agreements. And now we're kind of seeing a shift to some more like 3-5 year leases. That's kind of what I'm seeing. Let's see. And then I'll let Jim take over here and I'll click the next button.
Okay. So many of you folks have probably been seeing some different things in the news in recent years regarding some of the things that have been in the news surrounding what they call carbon and even hydrogen pipelines or different projects surrounding the United States with some of the different things attempting to address different things. And one of the questions we get is, can I be forced to provide an easement on my land? So an easement is giving someone or some business the ability to do something on your property. So could you be forced to give the right up to allow someone to build a pipeline on your land? And specifically a carbon or hydrogen pipeline? Well, the answer to this question has to do with what we call the Nebraska Public Service Commission, with what we term as a common carrier. A common carrier, an example of a common carrier might be an established crude oil pipe or a large energy transmission line. If you've ever seen one of those big towers where they have, power from a power plant going to a big city, for example, those are considered common carriers. Currently, under state of Nebraska, with this statute, pipelines are not considered common carriers if they are used for what we call carbon or hydrogen pipelines. Now, crude oil, natural gas pipelines, those are common carriers. But the carbon pipelines or hydrogen pipelines, they're not considered to be common carriers. Let's go to the next slide here for a second. And I think you skipped 2 slides. Go back just 1 slide. Go forward. There we go. Right there. And on this slide, and what I just highlighted before is just what we got at. Petroleum and natural gas are established forms of what we call a common carrier or even electrical transmission line, and they are open to that common carrier statute where an individual could be forced to provide an easement under those circumstances. Carbon and even hydrogen pipelines do not currently qualify, and the attempts to do so have been somewhat limited. You've probably seen some different things in the news on some of the states surrounding Nebraska, and you see a little map here in the bottom center part of this slide. There was discussion at one point in time on for this carbon capturing, where they wanted to run carbon pipelines between the major ethanol production facilities in the state of Nebraska, as well as surrounding states, to eventually develop what we call a different type of aviation, low carbon aviation fuel is what they were getting at. But as of right now, and keep your eye on the state legislature, I wouldn't be surprised if we see some bills getting introduced that might attempt to address some of the things surrounding carbon or even hydrogen pipelines. I know our neighbors to the north, they've had some things in the news as well in their state on some different policies they're pushing forward on this topic. I'm going to go to the next slide. Now, on the topic of easements, what about wind turbines? You still see wind turbines in the countryside, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's more proposals that they might build some more wind turbines. I know in the Rapid City, South Dakota area, there was some discussion on building some wind turbines out there here in the last couple of months on a major project out there. But in Nebraska, wind turbines are not considered a common carrier. Okay. Now, if you have to build a big electrical power line in between a couple wind turbine energy development sites, in theory, the electrical transmission line where you're carrying energy or a form of power, those could be a common carrier, but the actual wind turbine themselves would not be considered that under current state law. If you ever get approached by someone or something to consider putting an easement on your land, maybe even for a solar development, and you agree to, hey, we're going to get so many dollars an acre over so many years, I always tell people, if you're going to sign up with this stuff, that's your business, but make sure you talk to a real estate attorney or an attorney that has knowledge on how to handle these things, and make sure you buy, a couple hours of that attorney's time to review the contract, because once you sign that contract, that easement goes forward, whether it might be for a short duration of time for, say, a solar development or even a longer period. Just be aware of what you're signing up for if that's the wishes you would like to carry forward. Go to the next slide here. And I just broached the question on solar panels. What about solar panels? Can you be forced to provide an easement for a solar panel development? Once again, solar panels and wind turbines, those are usually voluntary easements. Solar panels are a little bit different because a lot of the stuff that you put out on that property, they drive those big steel pipes or posts into the ground. Yes, they still have to trench in stuff underneath the ground, but compared to a wind turbine where you have a large concrete foundation, um, I don't know how much of that concrete foundation would be removed if the wind turbines would be removed. But nonetheless, um, typically on solar leases, you're talking a lease for, say, 20 or 30 years. Maybe there's an option to renew the lease. In each year, you might get a lease payment for leasing that right out on your ground. Sometimes there's a small growth rate. It's last year's lease payment plus 2 or 3% or half a percent, whatever. And make sure, if once again, always consult an attorney. And if you ever do sign up for any of these things, where you might have a 20, 30, 40-year lease, what does the end term of the lease say with regards to removing different types of infrastructure? So you got to remove the old solar panels or remove the old posts or remove any concrete. What does the lease say? That's the critical thing. Let's see what we have on the next slide now. And there was one question. I don't know if there's any more that came in the Q&A pane, but there was one question earlier on that was put in the chat desk. Do cash rents are they always based on the price of corn only? What about if you have a property, let's say, where half of the quarter, 80 acres was in corn, half the 80 acres was in soybeans? It is fine to work through that example because there might be a different profit expectation. And it's a good thing to rotate crops over time too, but there's a different expectation in between those two crops in terms of profitability, and that might get reflected in it. I just use corn because it's a crop that's most commonly grown across the state, but many areas also grow soybeans, many areas grow wheat, other small grains, some specialty crops as well, when out in parts of western Nebraska to some extent. So the cash rental rate is just the reflection of the profitability or the earning potential in whatever you're investing in. Anastasia, the question is, what is a typical tenant farm lease percentage? Is it 50/50, one third, two thirds, 40/60? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so the typical lease arrangement in a crop share, it really is going to come down to where is your farm located? On the eastern side where the ground is very productive or it's irrigated ground, we do see 50/50s. Now, when we get into the southeast area, more into that central Nebraska area too, where the yield potential isn't there and we're getting a lot less rainfall, we see, 60/40s where the 60% is going to the tenant, the 40% is going to the landowner. And then as you work your way out to the western panhandle, we see a lot of one third, two thirds splits. Again, it kind of falls into where you at, where it's the risk associated with farming that area and how much rainfall are you getting. So with that, it's going, give us a call. We can talk one-on-one with you and kind of talk about what is happening. Hopefully this summer I will have enough responses to publish a crop share survey results that we did that I can break it down into, this is what we're seeing in this region and this region, and this is the expenses that are shared. So that is something that we are working on currently.
Okay, very good. We had a question come in here in Midwestern Nebraska. What is the going rate for cash rent for irrigated versus non-irrigated acres? Be aware that we covered that information early on in the slides. Brian Evans, our media specialist, I believe he'll be sending out a short message, and you can take a look at those slides when we post them online. Otherwise, I would suggest taking a look at the farm real estate website at cap.unl.edu/real estate. And I believe Ryan will be slipping in a link there where you can actually go and take a look at the farm real estate related information. And once again, the 2026 cash rents from the University of Nebraska will be published in the middle of May. And Ryan just typed in the answer here on the Q&A plane. And the USDA information will be in the late summer to early fall for time frame in September. Okay, we got a lot of questions coming in, so let's see if we can knock out about two of them here. All right, next question. I'll take this one. Are there very many flexible cash leases? And the flexible cash leases are something we've been talking about in our different forms of outreach we've been working with the Extension Service on this past winter meeting season, and even have some coming up here next week and at the end of March. Yes, there is an interest on letting that cash rent vary. The idea behind a flexible cash lease is the flexible cash lease is going to be reflecting the profitability of what we're doing. So, input expenses versus the value of the crop. It's one way in an attempt to address this uncertainty we might have surrounding different things. We asked a question that came in also is on the topic of flex leases. They asked, do you consider government disaster payments? Remember, government disaster payments only go to the operator based on federal law. If you would like to participate in a disaster payment, an individual must be an operator, meaning either you're the operator and a cash lease is the tenant, and a crop share, the operator is proportion to the lease, meaning if you have a 50-50 crop share, half of the crop goes to the landlord, half goes to the tenant. The landlord in a crop share is also considered the operator is the landlord. And the tenant is based on the proportion of the lease. The other thing a landlord can do if you want to participate in the disaster programs, you could do what is called custom farming. Custom farming, you hire someone to do all the different planting, harvesting, spraying, things like that. But you also have to cover all of the input expenses.
Yeah. I think when these flex leases really became popular, we were in a time that there were no government payments being made. And so we're in a different timeline in farm right now. So yeah, if you want those government payments, you need to be in a crop share or custom farm it yourself. Okay, so I'm going to take one of these here. For cost share rentals, how does real estate tax get figured into the owner's cost? So if you are in a cost share rental arrangement, it's really good to sit down and say, look at those expenses, right? The landowner is going to look at the real estate, the depreciation, everything. The tenant is going to look at the cost of producing, and then you're going to really sit down and look at, are you getting those equitable shares? So if I'm putting in 40%, am I getting 40% back? It's going to require a lot of communication, but that is taken into account with this real estate tax figured out, calculated into it. Just like when I look at it, most of the time when I do the numbers, seed is something that should be considered being shared, and it's all over the board if it is shared or if it's not.
All right, very good. Then the final question, are rural water lines, you talk about the rural water districts with some of the natural resource districts across the state, are they considered a common carrier? I don't believe so, but I'm not sure on that one. It seems to me a lot of the rural water projects tend to stay in that setback area along, the ditch of a public roadway where you can run, say, for example, overhead power lines from neighboring farm sites to the next one. As far as I'm aware, most of the rural water lines tend to stay in kind of that public setback that I'll call it the ditch. But I think what is it, 33.5 feet or something from the center of the road on either side of the roadway. Am I saying that correctly? But
And
that's
it might also vary upon which water district you're living in as well.
That's true. And you see a lot of things right now. I know where different areas of the state are getting fiber optics right now. Do they have to have fiber optics to run it? Well, if you cross the private line, that's one thing. But if you stay in the ditch along the public roadway where you have, where you can run utilities, I don't know if you have to get permission at that point. So let's highlight what we're going to be covering here on the next slide for next land management quarterly. And one thing I forgot to mention, hopefully everybody's still on. We have one more of our in-person landlord-tenant cash rent meetings next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow, at the Wayne County Public Safety Annex, right next to the courthouse. We'll be there working on one of our landlord-tenant cash rent meetings. It was actually rescheduled from January 29th due to the weather wasn't the greatest, but and it had low attendance as well. And so be sure to call ahead if you'd like to attend that meeting. And we'll actually be doing 2 virtual landlord-tenant cash rent meetings. And the meetings that we have scheduled are going to be on the last Tuesday and Thursday in March. And if you register for that meeting, we'll actually send you the handouts for the meeting. And those meetings will include the most up-to-date 2026 cash rents that are scheduled to be published in the middle of March. If you'd like to attend, please attend the cap.unl.edu/land26 link. Ryan Evans has popped it into the chat. And then on the next slide, we have our, let's go one more slide. And we will have on Monday, May 18th, 2026, we will be having our second land management quarterly for 2026. We'll be also highlighting the 2026 cash rents from the University Farm Real Estate Survey. Anastasia will be highlighting some of the different communications and decision-making surrounding agricultural leases. And we'll be taking those questions, so be sure to submit them before the meeting if you got, especially if you have a good question, you think that you may not be the only one. If you want to go back just one slide for a second, Anastasia. Also, if anyone's interested in helping out with the Farm Real Estate Survey, be aware that we have a small endowment with the University Foundation that you can make it a donation of any amount. And these funds help fund the actual Farm Real Estate Survey with the related mailing expenses and printing expenses of the physical survey that gets. So with that, if you want to drop down to the last slide of the presentation, if you have questions, be sure to reach out to us. Anastasia, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Don't hesitate to reach out.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining us.